This is the state of Michoacan, Mexico. Today, it is one of 32 states of Mexico, and to non Mexicans, a rather undistinguished one at first glance. Most of the indigenous people still living there today call themselves Purépecha, which means commoner in their native language. But don't let that fool you. The story of the ancient Purépecha is anything but common. They have a fascinating ancient history and mythology, and they also did something that few ancient people in the Americas ever did. They built an empire. And not just any empire. They built a state that was so powerful that when the Aztecs came knocking, the Purépecha crushed them. That's pretty impressive for a section of Mesoamerica that gets left blank on most maps and occasionally cropped out entirely. If you look at a map of modern Mexico today, you can see that the borders of modern Michoacan harken back to those old imperial borders before the conquest. In this episode, we're discussing the empire of the Purépecha, the Iréchikwa Tzintzuntzani. Let's go. Weirdly enough, this episode was one of the most requested topics from viewers, which surprised me because the Purépecha and the Purépecha Empire, while very interesting, are pretty obscure. Well, they were obscure to me at least. Hopefully, after this episode, you will all appreciate them as much as I do now. Before we get started, though, a few items are in order. First, let's talk names. Some of you might be familiar with the Purépecha Empire under a different name, the Tarascan Empire. The reason that I'm not going to use that term, even though I included it in the title of this episode, is that Tarascan is an exonym given to the Purépecha by the Spanish. And not only is it not exactly a compliment, Tarascan is not what the Purépecha would have called themselves or their state, nor what modern Purépecha call themselves today. Actually, what the Purépecha did call themselves in antiquity is a bit of a mystery because the term Purépecha, which means commoner, was probably reserved for the lower classes rather than the whole ethnic group. This is also why the term Purépecha Empire sounds really off to me. The state itself would have been called the Iréchikwa Tzintzuntzani, and I'm just going to use that term for the state and Purépecha for the people. Just be aware that this is not what most sources call it, but I prefer to use the indigenous names when possible. Second, let's talk sources. We are fortunate to have later written accounts about the Purépecha. The most important written source by far is the Relación de Michoacán, which was completed only a decade after the conquest of Michoacán, and was most likely written by Friar Jerónimo de Alcala, but we're not 100% sure on that fact. The Relación de Michoacán details the history of the Purépecha, their customs, and their state, and it is an invaluable resource, albeit a pretty biased one. A few other sources that document specific events also exist, but overall, our texts are limited, especially compared to what we have on the Aztecs. Obviously, like most cultures we study on this channel, archaeology plays an important role in supplementing what we know from written sources. While archaeology has been conducted in Michoacan for many decades, it's unfortunately been a bit sporadic compared to other areas of Mesoamerica, and finding scholarly work on this topic wasn't as easy as I hoped. Hopefully that'll change down the road, but for now, we've got to work with what we got. Third, let's talk about the Purépecha themselves. As I mentioned earlier, the Purépecha reside in the modern-day state of Michoacan, Mexico. However, their origins are somewhat mysterious because the Purépecha language is a language isolate, and it doesn't really fit into the wider Mesoamerican linguistic map. This has led to some speculation about possible non-local origins. The most radical of these claim that they may have come from South America. What gives this idea wings is that the Purépecha and West Mexico as a whole appear to have had close contact with the coastal cultures of South America around 1200 CE. Despite the geographic distance, trade was regularly conducted down the Pacific coast. Archaeology has turned up interesting artifacts in West Mexico. Certain Purépecha artifacts in particular appear to have a distinct South American quality to them. For example, this stirrup vessel is a type of pot that is very common from cultures along the Peruvian coast, and one that should be familiar to people who saw our last episode on the moche. But wait, I've deceived you. That is actually a Purépecha pot. This one is from South America. Is this a coincidence? Who knows? But hold on, there's actually more. This Tumi knife from the Sakan culture bears more than a passing resemblance to this copper knife found in Michoacan. It's worth noting that other people in Mesoamerica had metalworking as well, and that these similarities in pottery may be superficial. Nonetheless, these connections have also led some to re examine the Purépecha language itself and try to draw connections with other distant language groups and argue that there may have been some past migration from South America. I've seen linguists associate it with Quechua, the language of the Inca, and also the Chibchan language family in Colombia and Central America. However, the general consensus these days is usually that if there are such linguistic connections, they are very ancient ones going back thousands of years, not hundreds. I read one article stating that these connections are coincidental more than anything. It's also worth noting that what we perceive as a language isolate may in fact just be a historical bias resulting from some languages being written and preserved while others were not. So while it may be very thrilling to speculate on Purépecha origins, the jury is still out. Finally, it's worth saying that I do not speak Purépecha, and it is very hard to find good pronunciation guides, so my apologies in advance if I butcher this wonderful language. Okay, with those out of the way, let's take a stroll to Lake Pátzcuaro in the heart of Michoacán and the Purépecha core during the post-classic period. The Lake Pátzcuaro Basin is not just a beautiful landscape, it was also a rich one which made it a great place for humans to settle. The lake provided an excellent source of fish year-round, and in fact, Michoacán in Nahuatl means the place of fishermen. Tule reed marshes at the end of the lake also provided good sources of waterfowl, heron, frogs, and freshwater shrimp. However, the lake was also well suited to agriculture due to the moisture-retaining volcanic soils that characterized the area. The Purépecha didn't just farm by the lake, they also farmed on the basin floor and on the hillsides using terraces. In antiquity, large forests would have been plentiful and provided sources of timber and wild game, most notably deer, peccaries, turkeys, and rabbits. Sadly, most of those forests have been cleared in the past few centuries. Now, evidence of human occupation in Michoacán goes back thousands of years. Soil cores show maize pollen dating back to 1500 BCE, which suggests the presence of agriculture, but archaeology has not currently identified any sites dating to that time. During the late pre-classic and classic period, towns and ceremonial centers like Loma Alta, El Otero, Tingambato, and Tres Cerritos rose to prominence. Also during this time, there was contact from the Valley of Mexico, especially from the cultural giant of Teotihuacan, albeit briefly. During the post-classic, many of the smaller towns from the classic period emerged as city-states that interacted with one another. One of these cities, Angamuco, only came to light in the last decade after LiDAR scans of the area showed how massive it was. It had platforms, pyramids, ball courts, gardens, and a few elaborate burials that were excavated. The city may have had over 30,000 residents at its peak between 1000 and 1350 CE and covered an area of 26 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's a larger area than Teotihuacan. As far as I can tell, excavations and research are still ongoing at the site, so hopefully we'll learn more down the road. By the time the empire began to form, the city appears to have begun a decline. Speaking of that, let's turn our attention to the empire. The empire, or the Iréchikwa, traces its origins to the Wakusecha family line. If anyone is curious what Wakusecha means, it comes from the Purépecha word for eagles. The Wakusecha were not originally Purépecha, though, nor were they native to Lake Pátzcuaro. According to the Relación de Michoacán, their ancestors were Chichimeca that migrated into Michoacán from the north. These hunter-gatherers, as they are described in the text, took up residence within the Lake Pátzcuaro basin and integrated into the local Purépecha population. If this sounds vaguely familiar to some of you, it's because the Mexica, Tepaneca, and Alcoa in the nearby Valley of Mexico also trace their lineages from Chichimeca migrations too. Unlike their brethren, however, the Wakusecha abandoned their native tongue and adopted the Purépecha language of their neighbors, but they still preserved their martial Chichimec traditions. If this seems unexpected, there may be a reason. Some archaeologists have pointed out that archaeology can't really detect a great migration from the north into Michoacán, so if this great migration is historical, these groups must have been relatively small, and perhaps they may have already been fairly well assimilated before moving into the lake region. I should point out that the Relación also notes that there were Nahuatl speakers in the basin, so this assimilation may or may not have been even across the board, or there may have been other migrations. We're just not sure. Now, things get cooking in the 14th century when the Wakusecha began to dominate the political scene of Lake Pátzcuaro. The credit for this rise belongs to one Tariacuri, the first Irecha of the Wakusecha, and not the Mexican singer from the 1950s. His story, according to the Relación, is really awesome, and someday I'd like to return to it in exquisite detail, but we're going to keep this brief. Long story short, Tariacuri basically maintained a blood feud with the other nobles of the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin after his father and uncle were murdered. In his quest for revenge, he set about bringing these old enemies to heel and slowly growing his influence over the local political scene. By the time he died, Tariacuri had turned the Wakusecha from a local family to nobility to a bona fide dynasty and established a capital at Pátzcuaro. He split the lake basin between his nephews, Hiripan, Tangashuan, and his second-born son, Hikingahe, who ruled at Iwatsio, Tzintzuntzan, and Pátzcuaro respectively. If you're wondering why the firstborn son, Kuratame, was not included, it's because Tariacuri had him assassinated for being a drunken playboy instead of a good leader. So yeah, a dad who is willing to off his own firstborn son for the glory of his future empire is a dad who does not mess around. Under these new heirs, further conquests began to push Purépecha influence outside the basin, particularly to the Lake Quetzio Basin to the northeast. Now don't get the idea that this was a unified empire. It was pretty fractured and looked more like a loose alliance or coalition of city-states in the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin. This is also exemplified by the nature of their early conquests. These were less like territorial annexations and more like glorified raiding parties by war leaders to exact tribute and plunder so that it could be distributed to the raid's participants. Despite Wakusecha hegemony, this was a pretty loose tributary alliance that could have easily unraveled at any moment. This isn't all that unusual for Mesoamerica at that time, and it bears a lot of similarity to the development of the Aztec Empire. All that would change with the next Irecha, Tzitzipandacuare, the son of Tangashuan. Our sources are suspiciously vague on the circumstances of his accession, but there are hints that some type of succession crisis resulted in a civil war which ended with Tzitzipandacuare taking Tzintzuntzan by force. Under his leadership, the raiding and loose organization would end, and he would reform the Iréchikwa into a centralized state with himself at the helm. To this end, Tzitzipandacuare made some key institutional changes. First, he made Tzintzuntzan the sole capital and demoted the former co-capitals of Iwatsio and Pátzcuaro. This is actually the source of the name Iréchikwa Tzintzuntzani, which means the kingdom of Tzintzuntzan. More importantly, however, he established an administrative bureaucracy and began allocating conquered territories to loyal members of the nobility who would rule from designated administrative centers. These positions were, in theory, hereditary, but ultimately answered to the Irecha and had to be approved by him. He also relocated all the nobility to the capital, which not only physically removed them from their bases of power, but also allowed him to keep a close eye on them. Accompanying them to the capital were their daughters, who actually resided in the palace so that the Irecha could dole them out as brides to local allies, rather than allowing their noble fathers to marry them off to their own political allies. This effectively centralized power in the growing empire, and we'll see the consequences of that later. But first, let's take a look at the empire's expansion. Purépecha expansion was driven in large part to acquire valuable resources, such as tin, marine shell, malachite, azurite, hematite, cinnabar, pyrites, lead, opal, quartz crystals, salt, and gourds. By 1460, the empire had reached the important trade port of Zacatula on the Pacific coast and the Toluca Valley to the east. By 1470, under the leadership of Tzitzipandacuare, the empire stretched north of the Lerma River in the north down to the Balsas River Valley in the south. This represented the empire's apogee. For a brief moment, it was the largest empire in all of North America. This brought several ethnic groups under Purépecha control. Making all this possible was a well-oiled military machine. The Purépecha relied primarily on bows, arrows, lances, clubs, and poisoned darts as their weapons. Like other Mesoamerican armies, they used cotton armor and shields for protection. The bow and arrow in particular was of crucial importance to their art of war. The Chichimeca that had migrated into the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin kept their archery skills well honed, and it served them well. The Purépecha also placed a high premium on reconnaissance and intelligence, and to this end, the state employed a spy network on their borders. The army was divided into banners of 400 men that were based on villages or wards. These could be ethnic Purépecha from Michoacán or specific ethnic groups such as Otomi, Matlatzinca, Huetamecha, Chontales, and others. In the case of ethnic units, they were still led by native leaders. In an ideal campaign, the Purépecha army would intimidate a town into submission, but if they resisted, the population would be enslaved, resettled, or sacrificed. In their place, other Purépecha or ethnic groups could be resettled there later. At this high water mark, the Iréchikwa's expansion finally began to meet some obstacles. The kingdom of Colima to the west mounted a very effective resistance and actually halted Purépecha expansion in that direction. But the greatest resistance came from the east, from none other than the Aztecs. In their expansionist fervor, the Purépecha had pushed the borders of the Iréchikwa to the Toluca Basin, which was technically Aztec territory. Well, this was unacceptable to the Aztecs, and in 1474, the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, Iréchikwa, led a punitive expedition to reconquer the Toluca Valley and managed to bring part of the valley back under Aztec control. This basically ensured that the two empires would collide, and boy, they did, in spectacular fashion just a few years later. See, Iréchikwa had set his sights on Michoacán and set out to conquer Tzintzuntzan. Now, Tsitsipandakwari was no fool. He had spies all over the place and knew that Iréchikwa was coming. While the Aztecs were marching through the Toluca Valley over the Purépecha border and toward Tzintzuntzan, Tsitsipandakwari was busy assembling an army to meet the Aztec forces. Both armies would meet in battle. Later Aztec sources put Iréchikwa's forces between 24,000 and 32,000, and Tsitsipandakwari's between 40,000 and 50,000, a truly colossal size for that time. As if the disparity in numbers wasn't enough, the Purépecha forces were able to ambush the Aztecs on the first day of battle and inflict heavy losses. Remember what I said earlier, the Purépecha made great use of the bow and arrow. They were deadly archers. When the dust settled on the second day, the Aztec forces were almost completely annihilated. Diego Duran, who interviewed Aztec informants, later wrote of this in the History of the Indies of New Spain.
The Aztecs attacked the Tarascan army, but the assault was so unsuccessful that they fell into the hands of the Tarascans, like flies that fall into the water. At least, this is what the chronicle says. The massacre was so great that Iréchikwa decided to withdraw those men who were still alive in order to save at least a few. In this encounter, the Tarascans killed many valiant Aztecs, especially from the military orders of Cacique and Otomi. Among the fallen was a nobleman who was a close relative of the king and who belonged to the royal council of four from which the king's successor was chosen. When the Tarascans recognized his insignia, they carried him to the Aztec camp and deposited his body there, in this way showing their boldness and demonstrating their contempt for the Aztecs. Having mocked their foes, the Tarascans then returned to their own, not wishing to push their victory further.
Now, you would think that such a resounding victory would fuel further Purépecha conquest and reaffirm their military policy. But oddly, the opposite happened. The invasion appears to have spooked the Purépecha leadership. From then on, very few new conquests were undertaken, and much more effort was put into consolidating previous conquests and fortifying the empire's borders, specifically the eastern border with the Aztecs. Remember, the Aztecs had blown through the empire's border with no trouble at all, and had advanced quite a distance into the Purépecha heartland. To this end, the Purépecha built a series of forts along the border, and resettled the area with Purépecha as well as Matlatzinca and Otomi exiles who had fled the Aztec Empire. Further expansion into Colima and Jalisco to the west was halted completely. In other areas, the borders were pulled back to provide a better defensive line. The Aztecs would lead some raids along the eastern and southern border of the Iréchikwa in the years to come, but the conflict eventually grounded into a stalemate. This attention on the eastern border also resulted in the loss of the port of Zacatula, which appears to have reasserted its independence somehow, but my sources are cryptic about this event. Interestingly, this conflict with the Aztecs appears to have drawn an iron curtain between the Aztec and Purépecha border, and as a result, traffic between the two empires was very restricted and tightly controlled. An Aztec messenger would have to request permission to enter the empire at the border and wait until the Irecha himself approved their entry. This icy relationship stymied contact and the regular flow of goods and information between the Aztecs and the Purépecha, and this led to a lot of misunderstanding between the two groups. Oddly enough, Aztec sources preserve a lot of stereotypes that they had about the Purépecha, or as they called them, the Mixhuaque. Among their faults were that the men wore no breech clouts, only a doublet, or sequili. Their lip plugs were too big, their women wore only a shirt, they were bad cooks, and they all shaved their heads. On the plus side, they did praise them for their artisans and cotton work, so there's something good at least. It shouldn't be very surprising to learn that a lot of the interaction between the two empires was done through third parties, like the Matlazinca and the Otomi. Okay, so we've seen the growth of the Iréchikwa Tzintzuntzani. Now let's take a quick look at the center of the empire, the city of Tzintzuntzan itself. Tzintzuntzan is on the coast of Lake Pátzcuaro, and its name translates to place of hummingbirds. At its height, it was a city of over 30,000 people. Perhaps the city's most unique feature is its ceremonial platform. This behemoth of a structure is 450 meters long and 250 meters wide. That's the size of several football fields. 5 connected keyhole-shaped pyramids called yakutas jut out from the top. In ancient times, these yakutas would have been topped with wooden temples to various deities. Nearby would have been the royal palace where the royal family would have resided. However, most of the city's population was made up of commoners. According to later sources, the city had 40 wards each containing 25 households. Interestingly, no ball court is known to have existed at Tzintzuntzan, although they have been identified at other Purépecha cities from the period. Although the city was not master planned, archaeology suggests that it was divided into different residential, manufacturing, and public zones. Now let's take a look at the administration of the capital and the empire as a whole. As I said earlier, Tsitsi Pandakware made some radical changes to the empire's government after his accession and built out a bureaucracy to help administer the empire. I realize that bureaucracy isn't the greatest sounding topic, but I had to learn this, and now so do you, and I've locked all the doors. There is no escape. So let us behold the gears and cogs of the Iréchikwa. At the capital of Tzintzuntzan ruled the Purépecha king, the Irecha. He would be in charge of holding court, managing his large personal estates, administering justice, receiving emissaries, and sometimes leading the Purépecha to war. The Irecha also had exclusive rights to the products of certain local forests, such as lumber and deer, similar to royal forests that existed in medieval Europe. No big surprise there. Below him was the Peramuti, the high priest of the Iréchikwa, who also doubled as the chief judge for all but the most serious crimes. He also had the function of running the court and acting as the master of ceremonies. Below the Peramuti would have been various levels of priests serving in various state temples across the empire. Also below the Irecha was the Angatakuri, his governor, or perhaps as we'd call him, the prime minister. Below him were 4 Karacha Kapachas who governed the 4 sections of the empire and may have also had a military function as well. I'd love to show you these 4 sections on a map, but the sources are a bit vague on the boundaries, so my apologies. Also rounding out the Irecha's court would have been various advisors as well as tribute ministers who were in charge of making sure all tribute was properly collected and stored at the capital. Reporting to them would have been tribute collectors, the Okambecha. At the local level would have been the town and village leaders, the Angamecha. As we mentioned earlier, these positions were hereditary in theory, but in actual practice, the Irecha retained the power to confirm most office holders. The empire was ruled from a series of administrative centers that reported directly to the capital and in turn governed over a series of dependent communities. Obviously, there were some exceptions to this, most notably along the frontier where non-Purépecha groups were granted land by the state. They appear to have had more autonomy in exchange for their military service along the border. This is actually a very common arrangement throughout history, the most well-known example being the Russian Cossacks. Speaking of the military, the army had its own hierarchy as well. In times of war, the army would have been led by a general, the aguaputi. Below him would have been the captains, or cuangarirechas, who served as officers and assisted him in commanding the army. Now, that's all fine and interesting, but this new government had some fascinating consequences beyond making the administration and tribute collecting more efficient. But to get to that, we should look at the administration of another empire, and who better to compare to the Purépecha than the Aztecs? When the Aztecs conquered new territory, they basically came in, defeated the local army, or intimidated them into submission. Once this and the subsequent looting were complete, they basically handed over a list of tribute that the new territory or city would owe to Tenochtitlan on designated dates. And then they went home with plunder in hand. They usually did not dispose of local leadership, but instead co opted it. Thus, a conquered city would keep its leadership, their courts, and government, assuming that they didn't rebel. They were just expected to pay tribute to the Aztecs and behave themselves like good subjects. This arrangement of tribute paying vassals is called a tributary empire. Such empires, and the Aztecs were no exception to this, were held together by the military power of the empire's dominant ethnic group and their closest allies. In such an arrangement, little to no effort is made to assimilate the conquered or to fit them into an imperial order. If anything, ethnic boundaries are often strictly maintained. Contrast a tributary empire to a territorial empire like the Roman Empire. Where Rome went, they imposed policies such as the use of Latin in all economic and legal affairs, working closely with the elite of conquered communities by conferring special privileges, and establishing Roman colonies and markets in conquered territories. The consequences of such policies, unintended as they were, was a steady assimilation of the locals. While the Iréchikwa Tzintzuntzani was not Rome and never achieved that level of success, its central administration and order gave it a similar quality by successfully encouraging assimilation. As we mentioned earlier, when the empire expanded, it brought diverse populations all across modern-day Michoacán under its control. The Relación de Michoacán notes that these newly annexed areas had their own languages and customs. Heck, in the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin alone, there had been Purépecha, Nahuas, and two separate groups of Chichimeca. However, these groups slowly began to become Purépechized and adopted Purépecha values, religious practices, and the Purépecha language itself. Obviously, when you live in a multilingual empire, a lingua franca is a pretty useful thing to have, even if you're a commoner. Access to easy trade and exchange certainly helps too. For the elites, assimilating meant tapping into the Purépecha power and prestige. This was aided not just by the political centralization and administration, but also by resettling native Purépecha in certain areas and fostering the intrastate economy. Obviously, this wasn't even across the board. Different areas assimilated to varying degrees. The closer to the imperial heartland, the more successful this appears to have been. On the periphery of the empire and on the frontiers, assimilation appears to have been much more muted and even absent in some areas, and that shouldn't be too surprising. By the time of the Spanish arrival, the conquistadors noted that Purépecha was spoken over a very wide area by different peoples. Another area where we can see this in action is in religion. The official religion of the empire was a constructed state ideology that likely emerged as a synthesis of local beliefs and rituals. The final product was something very unique to Mesoamerica. There are some similarities between the state religion and other Mesoamerican spiritual practices. A good example are the Chocmul statues that have been found in temple remains. For anyone familiar with Mesoamerican religion in the post-classic, these are a common sight. They can be found all over Mexico and even at some Maya sites like at Chichen Itza. They likely had a role in sacrifices or offerings to the gods, but their exact function is not known for certain. Also, like the rest of Mesoamerica, the Purépecha had a solar calendar made up of 18 20-day months and 5 extra days at the end of the year. But oddly, there's no written evidence that the 260-day sacred calendar and day naming system was used. However, the biggest difference can be seen in their pantheon. Unfortunately, there's a lot of Purépecha gods, and a full survey of them is beyond this episode, but we should mention the main deities with the largest cults. Each city had its own patron deity, and they would host festivals that drew in crowds from other cities. The most important god in the official religion, and also the patron of the empire, was Kurikaweri. and he was physically embodied by the Irecha himself and closely linked with the Wakusecha. He was primarily associated with fire, the sun, human sacrifice, and war, and was portrayed with a black and yellow face. Ceremonial fires were lit and burned to Kurikaweri, and human sacrifices and bloodletting were also important parts of his worship. Alongside him was the mother goddess, Kuriwaperi, who was the goddess of birth and death as well as rain and springs. Most Purépecha communities would have had a temple dedicated to her. Her name means that which creates and grandmother. She was also the mother of Sharatanga, the goddess of the moon, childbirth, and fertility. Sharatanga was also married to Kurikaweri. All of these gods had their priests who managed specific rites, rituals, and festivals. What's most interesting about these three main gods is that earlier antecedents of them can be found in earlier times in different places. For example, Kurikaweri's sun cult first shows up along the Lerma River in the early post-classic, and the Kuriwaperi rain fertility deity appears to have been spread by earlier Chupacaro culture. Sharatanga may have originated with elites on the islands of Lake Pátzcuaro. At some point in the empire's development, the Wakusecha married their patron god Kurikaweri to Sharatanga, which created a divine household with Kurikaweri at the top. Thus, many different elements came together from within and without to form a very unique Mesoamerican religion. Another important consideration of the administration was managing tribute, which made up a large section of the economy. From regional administrative centers, tribute would pour into the capital. Ultimately, this was under the control of the royal family, but as we saw earlier, much of this was delegated. Items that are very well represented in documented tribute lists include maize, cotton cloth, slaves, household services, metal objects, armaments, tropical fruit, cacao, gourds, animal skins, tropical bird feathers, and precious metals like gold, silver, and copper. This tribute would have been stored in the storehouses at Tzintzuntzan and distributed to other elites and sometimes commoners when needed. As I mentioned earlier, the Irecha had extensive land holdings and had exclusive rights to the goods produced on those lands, whether they be forests or farmland. They also had special access to certain copper mines to meet their needs. Another important apparatus of the state's economic control were the state paid merchants. These retained merchants specialized in procuring rare goods such as turquoise, jade, marine shell, animal products, and precious metals from the far reaches of the empire, or even outside the empire itself. They guaranteed that the Purépecha elites would have a source of luxury goods to reinforce their status. Not all of the exchange in the empire was dominated by the state. Sources talk of large open markets where goods and services could be publicly exchanged with minimal state oversight. Women are depicted as the sellers in these sources, just as they often are in Michoacan today. These public markets would have had agricultural products, small game, dried and fresh fish, cotton, agave fibers, lumber, exotic lithics, slaves, and finished products like baskets, mats, nets, and ceramics moving through bartered transactions. And these transactions were important. In the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin, the population was so large during this time that maize and beans had to be imported to keep everyone fed. Later written sources document that the Purépecha were excellent craft workers who had a reputation across Mesoamerica. Perhaps the craft that the ancient Purépecha are best remembered for is their metalwork, which is very unique from the metallurgy that we see in central and southern Mexico. As I mentioned earlier, many have theorized that this difference is due to a South American influence on West Mexico, but there's a lot of debate around this. The Purépecha worked with gold, silver, and copper. They were very adept at making alloys of all these different metals. Most famously, they made an alloy of copper and silver that was referred to by the Spanish as the metal of Michoacan. Also, and perhaps more famous to modern day history nerds, they also produced bronze. Primarily from copper and arsenic, but occasionally from copper and tin when they could get their hands on it. Ah, yes, the Bronze Age, baby. Here we are. Now, most of these objects tend to be vanity objects such as bells, beads, pins, masks, and effigies. However, some tools such as awls, tweezers, axes, needles, and fishhooks were also made with copper and bronze. These could be made by hammering or by using the lost wax technique to cast objects. Purépecha metalworkers were also capable of embossing, gilding, soldering, and filigreeing. Unfortunately, not much of this work has survived the conquest. The Spanish made quick work of any precious metals they came across. Another well known Purépecha craft was featherworking. Exotic feathers show up on tribute lists often, and featherworking was considered a very prestigious craft. These were used to create costumes, shields, and banners for the elite. The Purépecha also took pride in producing lip and ear plugs from obsidian, turquoise, jade, opal, quartz, bone, and shell. These were not just prized for their value as personal adornment, but also as distinct symbols of rank. So, how did the Iréchikwa finally fall? The empire survived all the way until Spanish contact, and so we have very detailed accounts of its end. To tell the story, we have to turn back the clock to the fall of the Aztecs. When Cortez began to put pressure on the Aztecs in 1520, the Aztec leadership began getting increasingly desperate to overcome the Spanish. So serious was the situation that they actually sent multiple emissaries to Tzintzuntzan to request help from their archenemies. At the first meeting with the Irecha at the time, Zuangwa, they were dismissed. To Zuangwa, this request for help from their biggest rival was pretty suspicious, and he blamed their misfortunes on the fact that they, and I quote, merely sang songs to their gods instead of carrying wood to their temples to keep their fires burning. I like to imagine that the Aztec ambassadors may have made a reply about how the Purépecha probably didn't offer enough human hearts to their gods, but regardless, they left empty handed. Shortly thereafter, however, Zuangwa died of a smallpox outbreak that began to ravage the empire, possibly carried over by those Aztec emissaries. This resulted in the succession of Tangashuan II, but his hold on the empire was precarious at best. While all this was going on, Cortez was besieging Tenochtitlan, and by now the Aztecs were getting really desperate. In the summer of 1521, they sent a final emissary to Tzintzuntzan to plead for help. Now, these emissaries didn't know that Zuangwa had died, so when they arrived, they asked to speak to Zuangwa rather than Tangashuan. In a very memorable moment, they were informed that Zuangwa was dead, but since they were so insistent on speaking to him, they could be sent to the afterlife so that they could deliver their message to him personally. And with that, the Aztec ambassadors were sacrificed. Diplomatic incidents aside, the Purépecha were starting to get curious about what was happening in central Mexico and began questioning any outsiders they could. Remember, the border with the Aztecs was sealed tightly, and not a lot of free information could really get through. Eventually, they discovered that Tenochtitlan and the whole Aztec Empire had fallen and sent emissaries to Cortez to make contact. Cortez and Tangashuan exchanged messages and gifts, but the following year, Cortez ordered Cristobal de Olid to march to Tzintzuntzan to meet with the emperor. Now, while all that was going on, Tangashuan was putting down an attempted coup, and this cost him valuable time and resources. So when the Spanish arrived at the border of the empire, he was not able to order a defense, and so the forces there just let him through. When Olid arrived in the capital with an army, Tangashuan had just secured the empire, but had not been able to fully muster his forces. At this moment, Tangashuan could have retreated, played for time, fought out a grueling war of resistance, but with the Spanish already on his front lawn, he opted not to fight. Although the capital was looted thoroughly by the Spanish, this action did have the advantage of leaving him on the throne as a Spanish vassal. This created a weird situation where the Spanish considered themselves the rulers of Michoacan, but Tangashuan was still running his empire and still collecting taxes for himself and giving the Spanish a cut. Well, as you can guess, that situation wasn't going to last forever, and in 1530 the conquistador Nuño de Guzman passed through Michoacan to go plunder the West Mexican coast. The Purépecha welcomed him and by all accounts were very accommodating and offered him soldiers and supplies for his campaign. Unfortunately for them, de Guzman was a brutal man, even by conquistador standards. His conquests in West Mexico often have the word genocide attached to them. So yeah. When he discovered that Tangashuan was still basically ruling his empire and supposedly not giving the Spanish their proper cut of taxes, he seized Tangashuan, charged him with treason, tortured, and executed him before turning on the rest of the Purépecha and then raped and pillaged his way to the coast. In the place of Tangashuan II, native nobleman Don Pedro Quinirangari was named colonial governor and took the title of Aguaputi. He and the first bishop of Michoacan, Vasco de Quiroga, shared power and administered the former empire together. Their commitment was tested when another conquistador, Juan Infante, attempted to lay claim to the city of Arichu. To settle this heated dispute and to prevent a war, Don Pedro and the bishop got together and decided to preemptively put together a comprehensive report to the new viceroy of New Spain that would convince the viceroy to rule in their favor. The product of this collaboration was the Relación de Michoacán, and it worked. Thus, even though the Iréchikwa was dead and Tangashuan II discredited, his sons would actually take over as colonial governors after Don Pedro, and a form of the Purépecha government would survive within the viceroyalty until the very end of the 16th century. That's pretty impressive. In assessing the legacy of the Iréchikwa, I think it's safe to say that had the Purépecha resisted the Spanish at contact like their Aztec and Inca counterparts, history would remember them much better. While the Aztecs and Inca went out in a climactic last stand, the Purépecha went out on a much quieter note. We can certainly imagine how things would have been had Tangashuan chosen to fight, but regardless of our imagined outcomes, I think it's worth remembering that he spared his subjects a lot of bloodshed and destruction. Either way, I'm not going to really speculate on it. I'd much rather celebrate the Iréchikwa for what it did do rather than lament what it did not. Remember, in less than 2 centuries, the heirs of Tariacuri took a Mesoamerican backwater and turned it into one of the most successful states in the Americas, one that could go toe to toe with the mighty Aztecs. This culminated in a centralized state with a strong ethnic heartland and a very unique culture that stood out in Mesoamerica. The Iréchikwa Tzintzuntzani was nothing short of an incredible achievement. With that said, I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have. Big shout out to Kyle Urquhart, who assisted with the research for this episode. He is awesome. Everybody say thank you, Kyle. Special thanks, as usual, to my patrons listed here. You guys are the best. If you would like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.